Cool. Well, let's go ahead and get started today. We're going to start with some introductions. Carson, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone. I'm Carson Hunter. Like I said, I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm a technical enablement architect here at Postman, helping people inside and outside of the company kind of get the most out of the product. Before this, I was a software developer, so I've been really interested in how Postman helps people, in their productivity. So I'm excited to be here today.
I'm Ian Douglas. I'm a senior developer advocate here at Postman. I'm based near Denver, Colorado, right in the middle of the United States. And I've been a developer for a really long time, and I've been using Postman for a really long time. We're going to go into a little bit of history on what Postman is and how it's used, and we're going to teach you the very basics of getting used into Postman. But we want to start out by getting to know all of you a little bit more. And so we're going to show a poll here, and that should be open now. You can feel free to go ahead and tell us a little bit about you. So we're going to ask, what kind of role do you have? Are you into testing or development? Are you into management, DevOps, that sort of thing? As well as how much development experience do you have? Are you brand new to development? Do you have less than a year, 5 years or more? And then how much experience do you have with Postman as well? This helps to kind of guide our future Intergalactic webinars as far as the kind of content that we should do, as well as the level of the content that we should cover as well. So please take a minute to fill this in. We got about half of you filling this out so far. It's fantastic. I see all kinds of answers coming in. High percentage so far showing up as developers. Many of you with quite a bit of experiences in development, and a pretty good range of how long you've been using Postman as well. So we'll share these results here with you in just a moment. About 57% of you identify as developers, 21% as testing, about 7% into DevOps and so on. Got a few, 7% in management type roles, 4% as a student or a teacher. We got 5% as other. When it comes to the amount of development experience you have, almost exactly half of you, 51% of you say more than 5 years of development experience, 17% 3 to 5 years, 18% 1 to 3 years, 8% less than a year, and 5% brand new to development. And then as far as use of Postman, we're pretty split across here. 22% of you are brand new to Postman, 28% less than a year, and 31% 1 to 3 years. So I think this content is going to be very well geared for all of you today. 12% 3 to 5 years, and 7% of you say more than 5 years of experience in Postman. That's great. So welcome. We're going to get started and go through the content here. So we're going to share just a brief agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about Postman as an introduction and a little bit of history. And then we're going to go in, and Carson and I are both going to demonstrate a lot of things in Postman on how developers can start getting used using Postman. We'll talk about a few advanced use cases toward the end, and then we're going to share lots of resources for you as well. We have a moderation team. That moderation team is going to be dropping a lot of links in the Zoom chat. And recording this session is going to show up through Zoom, and all of these links are going to be in the YouTube description afterwards. We do post these videos up on YouTube. So if one of the moderators can actually drop our slide deck in chat, that will be a big help. And that way you can follow along on the agenda if you'd like. And so we'll show you a little bit here about that. So we're going to start with just a really brief history of Postman as we get started. So Postman's been around a little over a decade. We started back in 2012. And it actually started as a Chrome extension to test API calls. But now in 2023, we're a full-scale web application and desktop application for a full API platform for people that want to consume APIs as well as develop APIs. We cater to everyone from small users as far as like the amount of traffic you use, all the way up to enterprise scale businesses that are using Postman for building out their APIs. And we're going to show you kind of the common use cases of kind of consuming APIs within Postman in the application today. We do have both a desktop and a web application. Today we're going to be using the web application. There are some differences between the desktop and the web app. We try to maintain feature parity with them. There are benefits and sort of disadvantages to each. For example, if you use the desktop application, if you download that desktop application, you do need to manually update that whenever a new version comes out, where with the web application version, every time you load that screen, we're giving you the latest and greatest. But the desktop version natively, when you open that up, you'll be typically able to access localhost if you're doing local development as a developer, where the web application, there's a plugin that you'll need to install if you want to access localhost. So there are benefits to both. Postman as a platform is really useful for people that are in testing and DevOps, QA, and security, not just as developers. We're really trying to cater to a lot of non-developers as well. We've got a lot of different webinars and content, video content and live streaming around using our Flows product, which is kind of a visual tool for interacting with APIs. And so we cater to more than just developers, but developers are a very high percentage of the users that we see using Postman. So these are the topics that we're going to demonstrate today. I'm going to hand it off here to Carson in just a moment, but these are the main topics. So we're going to cover a little bit about Postman terminology. We're going to get into what is a workspace, a collection, and our requests. We're going to talk a little bit about environments and variables and how to do scripting inside of Postman. We're going to talk briefly about authentication, how to do debugging and troubleshooting, and then we're going to show you some usage of the collection runners as well, and then we'll wrap up from there. So Carson, let's go over to you. We're going to get started in the Postman web application. We're going to be using the web application today, but I'm going to hand it over to Carson, and we're going to get started.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Hi, everyone. So when you sign into Postman, you'll be taken to this home screen where you can see on the left, you've got some information about your team, and on the center pane, you've got some information about workspaces you visited and some popular APIs in the public API network. So in Postman, you're spending most of your time inside workspaces, which are a way to kind of organize your work and share your work with teammates. So if we click on this workspaces dropdown, you'll be able to see kind of workspaces you visited recently, as well as other information about workspaces from your team. So let's start by creating our own workspace, since we'll be kind of creating our own assets in today's webinar. And when you come to this page, it's pretty simple, but you're making kind of some important choices when you fill out this screen. So the first is the name. We'll call this one Intro for Devs, and we'll say we're learning about APIs. And when you fill this out, you want to make it informational so that whoever is coming across this workspace, whether it's someone on your team or someone on the public API network, they know the purpose of this workspace, kind of the work that's contained here, and they can know that they're in the right place. Once you go into choosing a visibility, by default, team will be selected, which is a great option if you're working, with a team. This allows the workspace to be visible in this workspaces dropdown. It allows anyone on your team to come find the workspace. Then if you choose, you can assign them permissions to let them work alongside you and collaborate on the collections that you've created there. As we move down in visibility, the next option is a private workspace. This is available on professional and enterprise plans. And this one isn't available for anyone to see. You kind of get to choose who can see it by default. This is good if you're maybe starting a project that's not quite ready for the entire company to see it, then you could later broaden it out to a team workspace for everyone to come in and collaborate on it. A personal workspace is for something only you can access. This is for if you're maybe tinkering with a new API or you just want to try out a workflow or some features. But in this case, no one else is going to be able to see it or collaborate with you. It's kind of only your personal workspace. As we go broader in visibility, we've got partner workspaces. This is our newest type of workspace. It's available on enterprise plans. It's kind of cool because it lets you collaborate with people from other organizations who aren't on your Postman team. So it's a way to kind of securely work together, and those other collaborators are only going to be able to see that workspace on your team and not have access to your full Postman ecosystem. And then the broadest you can get is public. This is something that's available to anyone on the internet. It gets published to the Postman API network. So, once you've got something that you're pretty proud of in your team workspace, you're able to share it with the public and have anyone come find it and try out your APIs. So we're going to stick with a team workspace so that Ian and I can work together. I'll be controlling his screen for this one, but if we were on separate accounts, we could be collaborating at the same time. So once this workspace gets created, you'll see we've got kind of a blank slate. We've got an empty workspace with nothing created yet. On the right, you can see kind of all the possible elements you could have in a Postman workspace. In the center, we've got an activity feed. a place for some documentation. And on the left-hand side, we've got what we call our context bar. So we've got collections, environments, and history available for now. If we wanted some other elements, we could toggle those on and off. But for now, let's stick with collections and environments and go from there. So let's start off by creating a new collection. And when we talk about collections in Postman, this is a way to, if we see it in the center here, save your requests in a collection for reuse and sharing. It's a way to organize your API requests, and you could have as many collections as you want and organize your requests into folders, or just leave them outside of folders. And you could have one collection for each API. You could have a collection for different workflows within the same API. They're really flexible for how you want to use them. But after we create this, it'll prompt us to give it a title. We'll call this one the Postman Library, since this is kind of the theme we'll be working with today. And you can see if we open it up, there's nothing here yet. And often when you come into Postman, you'll have an idea of the API you want to work with, whether it's an API you found on the internet, like a third-party API, or one that's within your company that you need to kind of build up a collection for. So if you found an API, out on the internet, maybe it's a Twitter API or something, we often recommend that you search for it in kind of the Postman API network to see if someone's already created a collection for you. In that case, you're able to kind of skip some of the parts we're talking about today and just start sending collections and adding scripts. But oftentimes, if you're working in a company, you might have some documentation that's, in a Google Doc or in a Confluence page, or maybe you have a developer portal, and it's kind of your responsibility to create that Postman collection if you want to work with it in Postman. So that's a situation we'll be working with today. And I found this Postman Library API. And imagine this is like a page on your internal developer portal or an API you've come across where you're building your own collection for. And so when we scroll down, we can see we've got several API calls that are available to us, and we're going to start transferring these over into our collection. So if we scroll down, let's find the first kind of request here. So we're working with books, and this first one is called Get Books by ID, Get a Book by ID. So there's several elements to this we want to be aware of. The first is this get operation. We want to make sure we're getting information from the API. We've got a URL here. We've got some headers telling us we're accepting JSON. We've got an ID path variable with an example value there. So it's going to be kind of a team sport with Ian and I copying and pasting between the two screens. So Ian's going to copy that URL, and we'll go in and we'll add a request. And we'll call this one Get Book by ID. And then Ian, if you could paste in that URL to the address bar, perfect. So you can see we've got our URL here. We've already got the get operation selected, but if we are working with kind of a different type of API call, whether it's a post or a put, we could select that here, and that would tell Postman the type of operation to do when we're sending this API request. We can see when we pasted that URL, we had an ID path variable inserted. So we've got a key, but we don't have a value. So let's go back to the documentation, and we'll copy the example value they have here so that we can send an example request. So if we can copy this ID value, let's see. Ian, would you mind copying this ID value?
Sure. Yep. Sorry, I need the mouse. Go.
Awesome. So we'll paste that in the value, and let's try sending this request. Awesome. So we've got some information coming back. You can see we're getting a single book by its ID, which is just what we wanted. And we've made our first successful request. We wanted to highlight a couple, other scenarios where this might happen. So maybe, you're not copying it over from internal documentation, but you've already got a set of maybe curl requests you've been using to test your APIs. And now you're working with Postman. You want an easy way to kind of transfer those in. So let's go in, create a new request. And the next one we'll work with is get all books. Get all book. Let's see, make that plural. And if we go back to our docs, One handy thing about these Postman docs is that it'll generate kind of an example request in the language that you specify. So we've got curl specified here. And if we view this, we can imagine this is a curl request we've been using on our local machine. We want to import it into Postman. So Ian, if we could copy this, and if we go back to Postman and go to our Get All Books, if we just paste this curl request in the URL bar, Postman kind of automatically imports this with everything we need to send this request. So if we go ahead and send it, this is awesome. We've got a list of books coming back, which is just what we wanted. Pretty easy, kind of one-click operation. And before we get too far, you'll see we've got these orange dots on these requests that we created, which is telling us we've got unsaved work. So before you kind of move on, you want to make sure you're saving your work, which you can do here, or there's a keyboard shortcut, Command S on Mac or Control S on Windows. And just make sure you've got everything saved so that everything kind of works the way you think it will when you come back to it. And we could go on and kind of continue creating these requests one by one. But for the purposes of this, let's move on and see how we can make this collection even more efficient and reusable. One way we can do that is by using Postman variables. And Postman variables allow you to kind of abstract information out of your request and insert values that can be reused or switched out for other values. So we're going to go ahead and create an environment here, and then we'll talk about what this means. So we're going to create an environment, and we're going to call this library production, since we're talking about kind of the production server that we've been sending requests to in this Postman library API. When we go back to our collection, this URL, I think, is a good candidate for something that we might want to pull out, since it's getting repeated in each of these different requests that we're adding. They're all going to be hitting the same library-api.postmanlabs.com. So this could be something we want to abstract out in case we want to switch it out to maybe our local server. So if we're working on this locally, we might be hitting localhost 3000 or localhost 8080. And we don't want to have to, create a whole nother Postman collection to work with that. By kind of taking this value out and switching out only the variables, we're able to reuse the collection we've already made, saving us some time. So Ian, you might have to help me here by selecting this URL, and then Postman will prompt us to set this as a variable. So if I click set this variable, if we had any variables already set up, it would show up here, but we'll click select a new one, and we'll just name this URL, since that's what we're kind of replacing. The value is already here for us. And if we click down to the scope, you can see it gives us an option to choose where we want to save this. So let's go ahead and make sure our library production environment is selected. And we'll have to select this again and get the pop-up to show up.
We were running into this yesterday. We're trying to select this again. It didn't want to come back up with that little pop-up. So
miss our chance. We can go to the other request if you want to as well. Do the same thing.
Yeah, we'll do it from here. Nope, doesn't want it to do it from there either. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and we'll manually create this as an environment variable.
Yeah. So we'll go into our environment, library production, and add this new URL variable. So if we click in here, we'll call it URL. You might have to type that one in, and we'll paste in the URL value we copied from our collection. So let's go back to talking about the scopes and kind of where you can store these variables. So when we popped up that variable creation modal earlier, we had the option to create a collection variable, an environment variable, or a local variable. And when you're choosing this, you want to think about how each of these is used. A collection level variable is a variable that can be used only inside that collection. So if you had multiple collections with different variables, those variables wouldn't be shared between your different collections. Here we have an environment variable. So if we can see, we're able to switch between environments in this dropdown. Once you have more environments, you're able to kind of switch between them. This is great, like we mentioned, if you have multiple servers, where you need to switch between server URLs or different sets of testing data. This can easily kind of help you reuse the assets you already have in Postman. Then the final scope is global variables. So you can see global variables displayed down here. These are kind of similar to environment variables in that they're available to everything inside the whole workspace, but global variables are always available no matter which environment you have selected. So you could use them with any collection you have, no matter which environment is selected. So if we go back to our request, now we have our URL variable saved. If we can replace this with the URL variable we just made, you'll see that once we hover over it, we've got this pop-up that's saying, oh, you do have a variable named URL, and this is the value that you've assigned to it. And in Postman, variables are denoted by these double curly brackets. You might know it as like the handlebar syntax. That's how you're going to refer to any of the variables you've made, regardless of the scope. So once you do this and save it, and we send the request again, you can see we're getting back the exact same data. It's working just as before. We've just kind of abstracted that data out and made it reusable. So I'll pass it over to Ian to dive in a little bit further to how to use these requests.
All right, thanks, Carson. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do based on this content. So you'll notice inside this request, we've got these two areas here. One is called pre-request script, and the other is called tests. We also have the same thing up here at the collection level where we have a pre-request script as well as tests. And what this will allow us to do is actually write some JavaScript code that we can execute before this request happens, and the test code runs after the request happens. So for example, in the pre-request script, you might need to set something up ahead of time, like maybe some authentication, or maybe you need to, maybe you're using these Postman variables to pass data around. The pre-request script could go retrieve a variable of data and do something with it. Maybe you need to do some encoding or some encryption. We have a large number of JavaScript libraries available in this sandbox environment here that you can use as you're writing out these test scripts. I'm just going to do a simple console log here where we can say something like request one pre-request script. And then inside the test script, well, actually, let me clarify this. So this is our pre-request script. This runs before the request is called. And then in the test code sandbox here, this is going to be our test script. And this runs after the request is called. And so anything that you put in pre-request script, this is going to execute, and then Postman will actually call your API request, and then it will execute anything inside the test code here. So if I go ahead and send this again, down here in the bottom left corner of the interface, you'll see a console button. And if we open up that console button, we'll actually see these lines here where we can see the console log that this code ran before the request was called, and then we actually have the request that we called, and then it's calling the test script block after that. So if there's anything that you need to pre-process before you call a request, you can do that inside your pre-request script. Sometimes there's, like I was saying, extra authentication you might need to do, maybe some encoding or encrypting of some data or processing some values that you're passing from request to request. And then inside your test code here, this will execute afterward if you need to clean anything up, or if you want to do things like assertions and so on. And so we'll touch on the assertions here. If I pull down the response body here, you'll notice on the right side of the sandbox, we actually have a large number of snippets. And these snippets are little code blocks that we generate for you just by clicking on the link. So you can see that we've got a large number here where we can get those different variable types that Carson mentioned. We've got environment variables, global variables, just regular Postman variables, as well as collection variables. We can also set those variables as well. So the difference that we often get asked is, what's the difference between a collection, global variable, environment variable, and just a plain variable? These plain variables are used in between the requests, and the scope is very, very limited. Where the collection variable actually gets saved as part of the collection that we saw, global variables are stored for like your entire Postman account, where the environment variable is going to be stored within that environment. So depending on the scope of how you want these variables and their values kind of accessible will depend on which type of variable you use. If we scroll down in the snippets here, we'll also see other things like I want to set an expectation or an assertion that what I got back as a response was a 200 code. So this PM is just our Postman object, And this is where we get into behavior-driven testing, if you're familiar with that. And if you've used Chai.js in the past, then we actually include Chai.js and all of their assertions. So this first string here is just a label that we give this test and say we expect that our status code is going to be 200. And then we say, okay, based on the Postman response, I expect that that response came back with a status of 200. And you can add as many lines of code in here as you like. And the way that these tests run is it will expect a true or false response as to whether or not that test passed. If this whole block of code results in a true response, then Postman will consider that test to be passing. And at any point, if something comes back as a false value, it will actually halt execution at that point. So for example, if I had a number of these lines in here, and let's say we expect a 201 and we expect a 400 and we expect a 500, whichever one of these fails, it's going to stop executing at that point and it's not going to run additional code. So very similar to most testing harnesses that you might be familiar with. And so if we go ahead and we send this now, down here at the bottom, we see our test result was 0 of 1. That means that something failed. And if we click on that, then we'll see that we expected to have a 201, but we got a 200. So it will give you a little bit of information about what failed. Postman will not tell you what line it failed on, but it will say like, hey, this was the expectation that you set up in your code, but it's not actually going to give you a line number of this failed on line 6 of this request. So you will need to go in and do a little bit of extra debugging. We're going to show you some of those debugging techniques in a little while. So I'm going to remove some of these other lines here. If we run this again, we see that our test is now passing 1 of 1. And we see that that passed down here. So the pre-request script will execute. Again, anything that you put in here, it's going to run this JavaScript code, and then it's going to call your request, and then it will run any code that you have here in the test block afterwards. If we do it at the collection level, it orders things a little bit differently. Basically, anything you put in the pre-request script, it's going to run this code before any of the requests, and then it's going to run the individual requests, and then it's going to come back and it's going to run the collection test code, and then it's going to go through and run the individual request test code as well. So the order of how it runs the JavaScript code at a collection level is a little bit different than what you might be used to just at a per request level that we see here. Someone was asking really quickly, can we pass variables between the pre and the post scripts? Yes, you can. And so that's all part of these snippets here where you can set just a regular variable. So if we set just a regular variable here, we can get that variable by a name, and it's just a key value store. The thing that you will need to keep in mind here is that if you're storing a complex data structure like a list or an object, you will need to encode that. We won't naturally store that as an array, so you will need to sort of encode it as a string and then decode it in order to use it again if you're doing data structures. If it's just a primitive type like a number or a string, you can just store and retrieve those values. And so there's a get and a set on those variable names as well. Cool. I'm going to hand it back over to Carson, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how to get into using these collections in a little bit deeper way.
Yeah, so now that you've started writing pre-requests and test scripts and sending these requests, as you start to get more and more of these requests, you're probably going to want to, remember what data is coming back from which requests and what properties are, involved in each of these responses. I know that's something I always struggle to remember off the top of my head. So Postman provides the save as an example button, which is super helpful for this sort of scenario. So after you've gone ahead and you've sent a request, if you click save as example, it's going to capture, the things about that request that you just sent. So what was the URL? What were the path variables and parameters you sent, and what came back? So people have a reference of, what does a successful request look like and what gets returned in that case. So if we go ahead and save that here, you start to see this drop-down arrow on the different requests that have saved examples. This is good for not only your reference, but as you start to build these collections and share it with your other teammates, they can, reference this as well, and they don't have to keep sending requests to the API. They can just quickly reference this, get the information they need, and start to kind of integrate that API. And on that note of documentation, if you don't really have a formal documentation page for your API, or maybe you have something that's stored in like a Google Doc, as you start to build out these collections and save requests and save responses, Postman will build out, almost their own documentation page for you. So we went to the Postman collection overview and we clicked on view all like complete documentation. You're taken to this page where you see kind of the information we saw in the developer portal page before. You got information on the request about, the path and parameter values. You have an example request in whatever language you specify, and you've got a response. So this serves as a really good documentation page that others can reference as you start to build that out, which is really nice. Another kind of use case for these example responses is building out a mock server. So a mock server in Postman kind of simulates the behavior of a real API. So it'll accept these requests and send you back some data that you've already defined, acting like the real API, but you're hitting kind of this mock endpoint. So since we've already got this built out, let's go ahead and try out creating our own mock server. So we'll go back to this new button, which is kind of the place you go to create anything in a workspace, and we'll find the mock server. So you can see it's here under the advanced tab, and you have the option to create a new collection in this UI if you want to, or you can select an existing collection. So we've got this Postman library collection, which is exactly what we want. And we'll name this library mock. And this will be our library mock server. So we've got our correct collection selected. We don't want to save this mock server URL. So it's going to give us our own URL that we can hit that's separate from, the URL we've been hitting. We want to save this in a new environment as its own URL variable so that we're able to kind of switch between those environments. We'll look at that in a second. We've got some options to put in a delay or make the mock server private, which we don't want to do for now, but we'll go ahead and create the mock server. And once we do that, you can see we've got this URL that it's generated for us, and this is what we'll be sending requests to on our mock server. If we go to our environment, you can see we had library production already created. Now it's created this library mock environment for us with a URL variable, and it's already inserted the URL that it created for us, which is perfect. So let's go back to our collection. And if we click here, let's extract this variable to use our URL variable. Let's see. Yeah, you might have to help me there. So if we set the variable, it's already suggesting this URL variable, which is perfect. We'll do that. We'll click save. And if we toggle over, we're now able to select our library mock environment, which is where our mock server URL is saved. We can hover over this variable and just confirm we're sending it to the right place. This looks good. We send this. It's now sending back not the live data, but the data we've saved inside this example. So mock servers are great if maybe you want to prototype out your API. You're kind of planning what your API should look like before you built it. Or if you're working with teammates, maybe you're the backend developer, you're working with a front-end team. You're not quite done creating the backend for this API, but the front-end team wants to start developing. You can build out a mock server that's going to simulate what your actual API is going to look like, hand them the mock server URL, and then once the API is up and running, you can just switch it out with the actual URL and things should kind of work as expected. One other thing to note is that you don't have to have just one example under each request. You can define multiple examples, whether it's using different parameters, like we were just getting fiction books. Now I want to get an example of getting cookbooks as well. And you can also define kind of the error state. So what does a 404 error look like? What does a 500 error look like? So you can develop against all these different states that your application can be in. That's kind of a brief overview of mock servers, but I think someone can drop more information on mock servers in the chat if you're interested in this topic, but I'll hand it back over to Ian to talk about kind of navigating more of these real world APIs.
One thing that I really love just before we move on about doing that mock server, Carson mentioned mocking out also error responses. So as part of saving that example, you can change this status code to something else. So if you want to mock out what a 400 or a 404 would look like, basically our mock server will match the HTTP verb as well as the URL and parameters, and it will send back the status code and the response body that you save in that example. So if you really want to mock out, what happens if I call a 404, then you would know if I call this ID, I'm going to get a 404. If I call this ID, I'm going to get a 500. And so the mock server can help you sort of plan that out. I've got a whole workshop I can run just on the mock servers. There's a lot of really neat stuff that you can do in there. Cool. Well, let's talk about the other main thing about APIs. Most APIs are going to ask for some kind of authentication authentication. On each request, we can come in here and we can go into the authorization portion here, and we can actually set authorization for each individual API request. But it's actually a little bit easier to do at a collection level. And what we can do here is within the authorization tab is we can specify for all of the API requests inside of this collection, we want to set a specific kind of authentication. The reason that I like to do this at a collection level is because by default, each of these requests, if we go to the authorization tab, the initial value of this dropdown is actually to inherit whatever authentication is set at a collection level. You can override it per request, but it's a lot easier just to have all of your requests inherit from the collection level and then set this one time at the collection level. There are a number of options that we support in here. By far, the most popular kinds that you're going to deal with are going to be API keys and bearer tokens, which typically are done inside of a header. And these are by far the most popular ones that we interact with. You may also be familiar with OAuth as well. And so I'm going to touch on these very briefly. We've recently also introduced JSON Web Tokens as bearer tokens as well. And so we'll go into this a little bit, and we'll get the moderators to drop some links in here about using authentication. So for the API key and the bearer token, what we can do here with the API key is you can specify what is that key called. Every API is going to be slightly different. Some of them will call it something like API underscore key, or it might be like API key. Every API is going to be a little bit different. We are working with some partners right now that as you sort of paste in their URL, it's going to automatically detect that, hey, we know that this is company ABC. We already know how their authentication is set up. So here's a link to go to your dashboard to go get your API key, and then you can paste it in here. And so we're working with some partners to make this even faster to get up and running. And so every company is going to be a little bit different. The most popular one I tend to see is API underscore key, and then you can type in a value of whatever your API key is going to be. There can be some dangers here, though, about specifying this value, especially if you're doing something that's going to be public facing. Within your team, as long as your team environment is relatively safe, you can certainly talk to your security teams about this. You may not want to put these values directly into the collection here. You may want to use something like an environment variable. This environment variable can also be really useful, as Carson showed, going back and forth between like the mock server and the production server. You could have a different API key for each sort of path. If you've got like a staging server and a production server, maybe a QA server, maybe you want to have a different API key here for each of those. And so we can do something where we do that in the handlebar syntax with the double curly brace, and then we could store that API key inside of our environment instead. We also give you the option with the API key, whether you want to set that as a header. Some APIs will ask for that as a query parameter. Some APIs will allow you to do both. And so we give you some flexibility there. The second most popular one that we see is just a typical bearer token. And the bearer token is typically already set up with a header that is called authorization, and it sets the bearer keyword in there. And so all we need from that is the token. And again, you probably want to bring that token in from an environment variable of some kind. And so we recommend using a variable, preferably at an environment variable level or an environment scope level. When we get into things like OAuth, we do add a lot more features in here because OAuth is a pretty complex handshake process. And so we can specify the version. We can also specify where we want to add that authentication data. Do we want it as part of the URL? Do we want it as part of the header? And then from here, we can get into things like refresh tokens, for example. One thing that we've recently added into Postman is if your OAuth gives you back a refresh token, you'll be able to set this checkbox here that will automatically refresh that token for you. So we'll watch those expiration times on the refresh token, and we'll automatically refresh that token for you. In the past, you would have to write some pre-request script at a collection level that says, go check if that bearer, if the OAuth token has expired, and if it has, make this request to go get a new one. We've simplified that quite a lot for you now into a single checkbox that we will automatically refresh that token for you. Down here, if there are other settings that you need to set for OAuth, such as callback URLs, auth URLs, access token URLs, you can set all of these in here. Again, with client IDs and client secrets, you probably want to set this as some sort of environment variable here as well. Again, we recommend strongly use those environment variables in here, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about how we might use that here in just a moment. And so there's a lot of advanced usage that you can set in here with OAuth. And then the last new one that we've added is the JSON Web Token, which is also a bearer token. So very similar to a typical API bearer token. In this case, though, we'll allow you to specify which algorithm you want to use for kind of encoding your JSON Web Token. And you can, again, put your JSON Web Token secret in here. Again, we do recommend using the environment variables of some sort. And then you can specify whether that's going to be base 64 encoded, any additional payload that you want to set. So we'll drop some links on how to use that authorization technique. So I'm going to go back to just the most simple one. We're going to say we're going to send an API key, and we're going to set this in here as just the name. And we're going to get that value from an environment variable as well. And I'm just going to call this API key. And then I'm going to show you how we would actually build this out. Now, when I hover over this, it says it's unresolved. And this little dialog pops up, and it's going to allow me to add a new variable at this point. And I can specify what I want that value to be. And I can also specify a scope. And it's going to pick out our current environment, or I can do it at a collection level, or I can do it at a global level. I'm actually going to add this to my environment, but we want to be a little bit careful about how we do this. And so I'm actually going to go manually add this to our environment and show you why. So I'm going to add this to our production environment. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add that API key. And we've got a couple of choices in here. And from a security standpoint, by setting this as a default value, then whatever I type in here becomes visible right away to anybody that happens to be walking by or seeing what we've got on our desktop. They're immediately going to see what we're typing in here. And so that might be a bit of a privacy concern. And so we do allow a secret type, which will mask things as soon as you type them. So for example, as I start typing the word password, you don't even see the letters that I'm typing. We just immediately mask that for you. The other consideration that we want you to take into account when you're adding things like API keys to your environment is to not add them to the initial value column. Anything that you add to the initial value will actually synchronize to the Postman cloud. Now, if you're working at a private level or at a team level and you're not going to be making this public, then it might be okay to put that in the initial value as long as your team is trusting those API keys. But if you do eventually want to make your collection public, we recommend don't put any sensitive data inside the initial value. The reason being that anybody who has access to this can actually click on this little eyeball icon over here on the right side, and they'll be able to unmask what you've typed in here. And so if you have an initial value in this field and you make your collection public, anybody will be able to unmask that and see that value. And now you're exposing your API keys where maybe you didn't intend to. So just a little bit of security upkeep on that. Let's see, the other consideration there is that anything that you type in current value is stored within this environment for your specific account. So for example, right now I'm in the web application, I'm logged in and I'm using the web app in my browser. If I were to switch over and start using my desktop application, even my desktop application will not have access to this current value because this current value is only stored within my browser. It's not stored elsewhere on my operating system. This value is only stored within my browser. And so if I switch over to using the desktop, I still will not have access to this, even though I'm logged in. So anything inside current value does not synchronize to the Postman cloud. It's only stored within that environment. And so if you do want to keep those API keys private, we do recommend store it in current value, share it in a more secure way within your team. But we don't recommend storing those kinds of things in initial value for things that are going to be public facing. Again, because someone can come in here and they can unmask what you've got and they'll be able to see what you have. Cool. I think that covers everything about the authentication side of it. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carson. We're going to go back into a little bit more around debugging and troubleshooting as well. So back over to you, Carson.
Thanks. So yeah, we've been sending requests and everything's been going pretty well. As we've been sending these requests, we're getting, successful responses. But if you're a developer, that does not always happen. And a big part of your job is to kind of handle and figure out when things go wrong, kind of what's gone wrong. And Postman has a couple features that can help you kind of narrow down and figure out what's been sent to the server and why things are coming back. So you can see here, we've got a URL that's supposed to be, corresponding to one of our environment variables. If we maybe forget to send a value for this URL, we'll probably get something like a 404 or some sort of error response coming back. So let's see, we'll go to send our mock. But if you have an unexpected kind of 404 error coming back, the console is a great place to kind of check it out and see what's actually been sent to the server and kind of investigate from there. So you can see here, we've got an error. Above here, we can see a successful response to our mock server, where we've got our mock server URL, everything's resolved, we've got a 200. But as we go down, you can see, this URL didn't resolve. And so we're not really sending a request to anywhere. It's kind of going into the abyss. And as you start to investigate these different requests, you can dig into, network information, request headers, response headers. If you send, put and post requests, it's good to dig into those request bodies, especially if you're using variables there. So you can see, if those variables are resolving, if they're resolving with the information that you think should be sent. And just kind of double checking things here can kind of, get you on your way a lot of times to figuring out what's the mystery error that you're getting back. And then once you've got kind of these individual requests working, you oftentimes want to see how they work inside a workflow. So in our Postman library example, a workflow example might be, we log into the system, we get a book, we check out the book, we log out. And we can send those one by one, but we want to see, how they work when you send them all in a row without any manual intervention, which is what's going to be happening on our server a lot of times. So for this to happen, you probably want to have tests in each of your requests, testing, which response is coming back, if there's any data you're looking for, if it's the right data. So we can see here, we're expecting a 200 request to come back. We know that works, but let's see what happens when we change it to expect a 201. Maybe we think this should return a 201. In this case, we know it's going to fail, but let's just, test this out. So if we send it here, we can see 0 of 1 of our tests are passing. But if we wanted to run these all in a row, we can use the Postman collection runner to run multiple requests in order and see how they work together. So when we go to our collection overview and kind of click into the 3 dots, we've got an option to run collection. So this will take us to a screen where it's going to display all of our requests on the left. So we've got our 2 requests here. If you have 100 requests and folders, they'll show up here as well. And you're able to move these around, check and uncheck them to your heart's content, and really get specific with the order in which you want to run them. And then there's some options over here on the right-hand side. We're going to stick with run manually. This is kind of the classic collection runner. If you want to schedule runs or automate them via the CLI, Ian will get into that in a couple of minutes. There's also some advanced options where you can run it multiple times with an iteration. Maybe you want to run it 2 times in a row. Maybe you want to insert a delay. You could even run it with a data file. So if we wanted to, check out a book, and try it with multiple book titles, we could have a data file, maybe a CSV or a JSON file with a whole list of book titles, and it's going to run that collection once for each line in that data file, kind of passing in one book title every time, so that we don't have to kind of create a bunch of different requests. We can just pass in the data we want and test them kind of in bulk. And for this example, we're going to persist the responses, which I think is a good choice if you're debugging. So that's going to save the data that's come back from the server, so you can see what's come back. If you get any errors, you can help debug that. There's some advanced options down here as well. Ian, did you have any?
Yeah, before you run that, we probably want to set this one up to production, just to run the collection here.
Good call. Something I often forget to do. So let's run this and see what happens. So we can see we've got all of our requests run here. If we had any failing tests, we could look in here. We can see the response that's coming back from the server. You can see the headers for both the request and the response if you need to do any debugging there. And then if you're sending kind of a post or a put request, you can see that request body data right in here. So those are some good options to make sure that your requests work all in a row, a good debugging option just to make sure your systems are working as expected. But Ian, what happens if you want to kind of take that a step further?
That's great. So if we come back over to that collection, I'm going to actually just close up some of these tabs here, just so we can kind of get back to that a little bit faster. We'll save our work inside of here. All right, so if we come back over to the collection runner, another way that we can get to that collection runner, if we click on the collection itself, oh, that doesn't want to work for me. Uh-oh, what happened? All right, let me refresh here. All right, so if we go to the collection, another place to get into the collection runner, if you click on the collection, you can use the 3 dots and go to run collection as Carson showed. There's also a run button in the UI that you can click on as well to go back and we can see these. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the scheduled runs and the command line interface runs as well. So the scheduled runs, this is using something called Postman monitors, and Postman monitors are effectively Postman's version of a cron job where you can schedule how often you want this to run. You can give it a name, and then you've got kind of a granularity here of how frequently you want to run this. We have down to the minute, down to the hour, and then a weekly timer. The weekly is basically a daily timer from here. So for example, under the week, you can say, I want to run every day. I want to run Monday to Friday, and then you can specify the time of day. If you do an hourly timer, then you can say, I want to run every hour, every 2 hours. And then there's some other settings down here as far as which environment you want to use. You might want to use a production system for this. How many iterations, so how many times do you want to run at that frequency? Again, with the data file, if you want to import values. And then if you want to get notified, you can specify a number of team members here, and you can set this up basically using Postman monitors. You can also tell, hey, stop emailing me if it fails like multiple consecutive times, so you don't wake up to like 500 messages in your inbox. You can limit how many times it will email you before it'll say like, hey, you've kind of reached that limit. One thing to note for the collection runner here, if you're running manually, we do have kind of a maximum count that you can do this on a manual basis on your monthly plan. Same thing with the monitors. There are a certain quantity of those calls that you can make in a month, depending on which plan that you're on. And so we also do offer automated runs using command line tools. Our most popular command line tool is Newman. It's been around for a number of years. It's kind of our community-driven command line interface. Last fall, we also released the Postman CLI, and that's the newer version, and that's built and maintained only by the Postman team. And they each have features that the others don't have. For example, Newman can do a lot more reporting. The Postman CLI can do a lot more of our enterprise work like API linting and security checking and so on. So there are reasons to use either or both of those. But the nice thing about CLI is we actually integrate with a lot of CI/CD platforms. So Circle CI, Travis CI, Jenkins, GitHub Actions, and so on. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. So by default, we've got a link here where you can download the Postman CLI and get using that. And we'll actually show you the command line that you can do right here to actually paste this into your command line. If you're going to get into shell scripting around, go run this collection, and if everything passes, then you can continue with the deployment. So if you want to kind of hand roll your own shell scripting, you'll be able to do that. There's a button here to go fetch your Postman API key, or to go generate a Postman API key, which the Postman CLI will need, so will Newman. But if you want to do this in a CI/CD environment, then there's also a link here to configure that command. And this is basically going to allow you to choose which CI/CD pipeline you want to integrate with. So we've got a number of integrations such as Bitbucket pipelines, Azure pipelines, GitHub Actions, and so on. And you'll be able to choose the configuration that you want. And it's basically going to build all the configuration that you need here. So for example, if we want to change this over to GitHub Actions, here's the configuration that you'll need. And you can go in and you can specify these API keys. Again, it's using a variable here. So there is an expectation that you're going to set up your Postman API key in a secure way within, in this case, GitHub Actions. You're going to store that over on GitHub in a secure way. And then you're telling it which collection you want to go run. And so we help you out by building these config files for you to get started. And then you can certainly customize these as much as you like. And so you can copy these, you can generate more API keys for each of those environments. And we also give you some help here as well on how to set that in your respective environment. So really, really handy way to sort of get around some of those limitations of manually running the collection runner, because we do limit how many times you can manually click this button. We also limit the schedule runs. It's a whole lot more than actually coming in and running it manually. So we generally recommend run it manually a few times. Once you know that that's working okay, then you can set that up as a scheduled run, and it'll just alert you like, hey, something about that API no longer works. And so this would be a really good use case for kind of watching over time, did something break at some point, and you'll get an email notification that Postman was not able to run your collection runner from there. So we did want to cover that a little bit. I know we're pretty much running out of time here, so I'm going to hand it back over to Carson. We're going to wrap up from here.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So we'll head back into the slide deck and go to kind of our wrap-up slides. We've got some information on some resources for you to kind of take this content further. I know we covered a lot today, but a lot of good information to dive into if you're interested. So at the top here, we've got our Postman Intergalactic webinar series. If you're interested in any of the other topics we've covered in the past, you can check those out here or sign up for some of the upcoming sessions. 30 Days of Postman. This is a workspace that has tons of exercises where you can really dive into the topics, a lot of which we covered today. It's a great way to kind of wrap your head around a lot of Postman features and increase your productivity in your day-to-day work. The community forum is a great place to go. If you've got any questions, you can browse questions that have been asked by others, ask your own questions, see kind of what's going on in the Postman universe. And then the Postman documentation, our learning center, is really great. We've got a lot of thorough documentation, examples on how to do things. So definitely worth checking out if you've got any questions about how things work. If we go to the next slide. Just to wrap up, I don't think we have time for Q&A, Ian, but...
Well, we do have one quick question that I think we'll cover, and then we'll get the moderators to drop this feedback form in the chat for us as well. Please do take a moment to fill out this feedback form for us. Again, it helps inform us about our webinar. We did have one question come in from Melvin asking, can we use the mock response and make it more dynamic based for different kinds of environments? So the mock servers are getting smarter. When you're using a RESTful API, we do take kind of a simpler approach where it's only looking at the method and the path and any parameters, and you can set additional settings around, like looking at the headers and looking at the body to send back an appropriate response. But it is a pretty static response system that we've built up. When we get into some of the more interesting types of APIs like gRPC, we do a little bit more on the dynamic side of that, because there is data typing involved with things like gRPC. And so we know, oh, this field is an integer, and so we can start to kind of randomize and make those a little more dynamic, or be able to receive more dynamic data. But definitely check out the documentation on that. Definitely hit us up on the community forum as well. We can certainly point you to more documentation around all of that. So yeah, there's the mock server team is actually building a lot of really interesting things around that. Can't share too much right now, but we've got some really interesting stuff coming up on the roadmap. So. Cool. That was the only question that the moderators reserved for us. It looks like they answered over 40 questions for you in chat. So big thank you to the moderators for helping us out and dropping all those links in chat. Big thank you, Carson, for helping out today. Hopefully this gives everyone a good introduction into Postman and how to use Postman as a developer. Again, this recording is going to be on Zoom. You'll get an email from Zoom about the recording, and we'll get this video up on YouTube with chapter notes and all the links. We'll get that up very, very soon as well. And again, if you want to check out 30 Days of Postman, you can also search for that within Postman itself. Just up here at the very top, you can search for 30 Days of Postman. And you want to find the one that's actually made by the Postman team. And that'll take you through kind of a self-paced tutorial on all the stuff that we covered today. And it's going to go into much, much more detail for you. So definitely want to check that out. You'll be able to sort of make a copy of that into your own workspace, and you'll be able to work at that at your own pace. And there's I think a digital badge that we'll give you at the end if you complete and get all the way through everything. So big thank you again to everyone who came today. I know we're a couple of minutes over time, so we're going to wrap up here. Please reach out to us on the community forum if you do have other questions. And we'll see you. We do have another Postman session coming up on May 31st. We're going to be getting into an intermediate level session on getting into advanced testing techniques. So please go register for that. It's free to register for all of our webinars on a monthly basis. So please come back. We'll see you at the end of May, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.